This is a map of Ukraine. The version you're looking at was printed in 2013, back when the country's borders were internationally recognized and uncontested. Crimea is Ukrainian. Donbas is Ukrainian. The Sea of Azov has two coastlines, both Ukrainian. This map cost $14.99 at a bookstore in Washington, D.C. It is now a historical artifact, a document of a country that no longer exists in the shape it shows. But here's what's strange. If you walk into NATO headquarters in Brussels today and ask for the official map used in operational planning, they'll hand you something almost identical. Crimea is shown as Ukrainian territory under occupation. The Donbas oblasts are shown as Ukrainian territory under occupation. The 18% of Ukraine that Russia has annexed or controls is depicted as temporarily lost, recoverable through military or diplomatic means. That map is a lie that NATO tells itself. And on January 16, 2026, the lie became impossible to sustain. At 9 a.m. Brussels time, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte convened an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council to address what internal documents describe as strategic posture recalibration in the Eastern European theater. No press conference followed, no communique was issued, but within 48 hours, 3 NATO member states had recalled their military attachés from Kiev for consultations, the diplomatic equivalent of pulling the emergency brake. The red line that NATO refuses to cross isn't about weapon systems or troop deployments. It's about something more fundamental, the acknowledgement that Ukraine cannot win this war, and the decision about what happens next. Here's what they're not telling you. Ukraine's military situation has deteriorated along 3 axes simultaneously, and the intersection of those axes creates conditions that no amount of Western support can reverse. Axis 1. Manpower. Ukraine's mobilization system has effectively collapsed. The initial waves of motivated volunteers who fought through 2022 and 2023 are dead, wounded, or exhausted beyond combat effectiveness. Replacement troops are increasingly conscripted from populations with no military training and diminishing willingness to serve. Desertion rates, classified but leaked to Der Spiegel in December, have reached 12% of frontline units, a figure that historically precedes military disintegration. Axis 2. Ammunition. NATO's collective industrial base produces approximately 1.2 million 155mm artillery shells annually. Ukraine consumes that quantity in 4 months of active combat. The gap has been filled by drawing down alliance stockpiles to levels that NATO commanders have privately described as operationally compromising. The shells being fired in Donbas today were manufactured for contingencies that cannot now be met if they arise elsewhere. Axis 3. Air defense. Ukraine began the war with Soviet-era S-300 systems that have been systematically depleted. Western replacements, Patriot batteries, NASAMS units, IRIS-T systems, have been provided in quantities sufficient to protect critical infrastructure, but insufficient to establish the air superiority that offensive operations require. Russia launches an average of 120 drones and missiles per week. Ukraine intercepts approximately 70%. The 30% that penetrate are slowly dismantling the electrical grid, transportation network, and command infrastructure that make coordinated military operations possible. At 4:30 a.m. Kyiv time on January 14th, a Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missile struck the Tripilska thermal power plant, the largest remaining electricity generation facility serving the Kyiv region. The plant had been hit before and repaired. This strike destroyed the turbine hall with a precision that indicates either exceptional intelligence or internal compromise. Repairs will take 18 months. Kyiv will spend the remainder of this winter with rolling blackouts averaging 8 hours per day. This is not a military stalemate. This is attrition warfare in which one side is being attrited faster than it can be replaced. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. NATO's strategic theory of the war rests on an assumption that internal documents call Russian culmination, the point at which Russian offensive capacity exhausts itself and the military balance shifts toward Ukraine. This theory was plausible in 2022, when Russian logistics failures and Ukrainian tactical brilliance produced a war of movement that favored the defender. It became questionable in 2023, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive failed to breach Russian defensive lines despite Western equipment and training. It is now untenable in 2026, because the data shows Russian capacity increasing rather than decreasing. Russian artillery shell production has reached 3 million rounds annually, triple NATO's output, and sufficient to maintain current operational tempo indefinitely. Russian drone production, supplemented by Iranian and North Korean supply chains, exceeds 4,000 units per month. Russian military personnel, bolstered by recruitment bonuses, prison conscription, and contract soldiers from Central Asia, have stabilized at approximately 700,000 active troops in the Ukrainian theater. The economic sanctions that were supposed to cripple Russian war production have instead catalyzed import substitution and supply chain realignment. Russia's 2025 GDP grew 3.1%, faster than Germany, France, or the United Kingdom. Military spending has reached 6.7% of GDP without triggering the fiscal crisis that Western economists predicted. The ruble, after its initial collapse, has stabilized at levels that make dollar-denominated debt manageable. None of this means Russia is winning in the sense of achieving its original objectives. The occupation of Ukraine, the installation of a puppet government, the absorption of Ukrainian territory into a reconstituted empire, these goals remain beyond Russian reach. But Russia doesn't need to achieve those objectives. Russia only needs to continue fighting longer than the West is willing to support Ukraine's resistance. And on January 16th, NATO's internal assessment concluded that the timeline has inverted. Russia can sustain current operations for a minimum of 5 additional years. Western political consensus for Ukraine support is unlikely to survive beyond the next electoral cycle, 18 months at most. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. The January 16th North Atlantic Council session produced no public decisions because the decisions being discussed cannot be made public. But sources present have described the options under consideration, and all of them cross lines that NATO has previously declared uncrossable. Option 1. Territorial concession. Accept that Crimea and portions of Donbass are permanently lost, negotiate a ceasefire that freezes current lines, and pivot Western support toward rebuilding what remains of Ukraine as a viable state. This option requires telling Kyiv that the territory where 8 million Ukrainians lived before the war will not be recovered, and telling domestic populations that 3 years of support and $200 billion in aid purchased a smaller Ukraine, not a victorious one. Option 2. Escalation. Provide Ukraine with the weapon systems that have been withheld, ATACMS missiles with full range, F-16s in sufficient quantities for air superiority, and potentially offensive cyber capabilities targeting Russian infrastructure. This option carries risks of Russian retaliation against NATO territory that no member state has agreed to accept, and assumes that escalation produces negotiated settlement rather than counter-escalation. Option 3. Strategic ambiguity. Continue current support levels while quietly reducing commitments, allow the military situation to deteriorate until Ukraine requests negotiations, and position NATO as responsive to Ukrainian decisions rather than responsible for them. This option preserves political deniability, but guarantees Ukrainian defeat, a slow-motion abandonment disguised as principled restraint. The fourth option, the one that was discussed but not minuted, is the deployment of NATO ground forces to create a tripwire presence that would convert Russian offensive operations into direct NATO-Russia conflict. This option was raised by Polish and Baltic representatives, who have concluded that Ukrainian defeat will be followed by Russian pressure on NATO's eastern frontier. It was rejected by the United States, Germany, and France within the first hour of discussion. The red line is there. It's a line that separates support from intervention, aid from alliance, and proxy conflict from world war. NATO will not cross it, and that means Ukraine must fight with whatever NATO provides, rather than whatever Ukraine needs. Less than 72 hours after the Brussels session, the White House announced a new $2.5 billion security assistance package, Stinger missiles, artillery rounds, and Bradley fighting vehicles. The package was described as demonstrating continued commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. It was not described as sufficient to change battlefield outcomes, because it isn't. While one side debates, the other side advances. Russia's strategy has shifted from territorial conquest to infrastructure destruction, a recognition that occupying Ukraine is harder than incapacitating it. The January 14th strike on Trypilska was part of a coordinated campaign that has targeted 78% of Ukraine's thermal generation capacity since October. The intent is not military in the traditional sense. Electrical infrastructure has limited direct combat value. The intent is societal collapse. A nation without reliable electricity cannot maintain industrial production, cannot heat homes through winter, cannot operate hospitals at full capacity, cannot preserve food supply chains, and cannot sustain the civilian morale that permits continued resistance. Russia is fighting a war of exhaustion, in which the target is not the Ukrainian army, but the Ukrainian population's willingness to endure. This strategy was developed explicitly to exploit NATO's red line. Russia understands that NATO will provide weapons, but not troops, will support defense but not compel victory, will condemn attacks on civilians but not retaliate against the infrastructure launching those attacks. The red line creates a strategic space in which Russia can operate with impunity, degrading Ukraine's capacity to function as a society while remaining below the threshold that triggers NATO intervention. China's role in this strategy is providing economic backstop that makes Western sanctions survivable. Sino-Russian trade reached $240 billion in 2025, with China purchasing Russian energy at discounts that subsidize the war effort, while providing manufactured goods that replace Western imports. Beijing has not provided weapons directly, maintaining the fiction of neutrality, but Chinese components have been found in Russian drones, Chinese semiconductors in Russian guidance systems, and Chinese financial infrastructure in sanctions evasion schemes. The red line NATO refuses to cross in Ukraine is the same red line China expects NATO to refuse to cross in Taiwan. Every month that the Ukraine conflict continues without NATO escalation confirms Beijing's assessment that Western security guarantees are conditional, limited, and ultimately unwilling to risk great power war. The lesson being learned in Moscow is being studied in Beijing. This is not about one conflict in one country. This is about the demonstration that red lines exist and the calculation by adversaries about how to operate beneath them. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. Ukraine cannot win without Western intervention that NATO has ruled out. Russia cannot win without Western abandonment that NATO cannot publicly embrace. The result is a frozen conflict with a slow Ukrainian bleed, territory held but eroding, sovereignty preserved but meaningless, independence maintained in theory while dependence deepens in practice. This outcome serves no one's stated interests, but has become the equilibrium toward which all policies converge. For the United States, continued support without resolution drains resources from Pacific posture at precisely the moment China is accelerating Taiwan preparations. Every HIMARS system sent to Ukraine is a HIMARS system not pre-positioned in Guam. Every artillery shell fired in Donbass is a shell not stockpiled for Korean contingencies. The opportunity cost of Ukraine has become strategically significant, but acknowledging that cost is politically impossible. For Europe, the war has revealed defense dependencies that decades of underinvestment created. European NATO members collectively spend $380 billion on defense annually, more than Russia by a factor of 4, yet cannot produce the ammunition, cannot recruit the personnel, and cannot project the power required to determine outcomes in a land war on their own continent. The gap between capability and commitment has been exposed, and closing it requires political choices that no European electorate has endorsed. For Ukraine, the mathematics are existential. Every month of continued war costs 10,000 casualties, 30,000 refugees, and measurable degradation of the infrastructure required for post-war recovery. The choice between fighting for territory and preserving population is becoming binary. The nation that survives this war will be smaller, older, and poorer than the nation that entered it, regardless of where the final lines are drawn. For Russia, the mathematics are painful but sustainable. The war costs approximately $180 billion annually, a burden that oil and gas revenues cover at current prices. Casualties, while significant, have not triggered domestic instability. The political system permits indefinite continuation without electoral accountability. Putin can lose this war in the history books while winning it on the calendar, simply by continuing longer than his opponents. This is what a system looks like when no party can achieve its objectives, and no party can afford to stop trying. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. Defense contractor stocks have diverged sharply from broader market indices since November. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman have risen 23% on average, reflecting investor expectation of sustained conflict and expanded NATO procurement. The market is pricing in a security environment that official statements describe as temporary, but investment flows treat as permanent. Gold purchases by Eastern European central banks have accelerated to record levels. Poland added 130 tons in 2025, more than any year since regaining independence. Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania have collectively added 85 tons. These purchases reflect assessment by governments on NATO's eastern frontier that alliance guarantees may prove insufficient and national reserves may become the final line of security. Ukrainian hryvnia has depreciated 34% against the dollar since October, despite IMF support programs and Western financial assistance. Currency markets are pricing sovereign risk that official solidarity rhetoric doesn't acknowledge. The divergence between what leaders say and what markets price has never been wider. Physical gold premiums in Warsaw and Bucharest have reached 5.4%, the highest in Eastern Europe, and a signal that populations near the conflict zone are preparing for contingencies their governments won't discuss. The market for atoms is separating from the market for promises because promises have proven unreliable. The question is not whether the Ukraine war reaches a resolution. The question is, who understands the shape of that resolution before it becomes visible, and positions accordingly? A map printed in 2013, borders that existed before the world changed, and a red line that separates what NATO will provide from what Ukraine needs. A line drawn not in geography but in political will, visible to everyone who has learned to see what institutions refuse to say. This is not a policy debate. This is the slow-motion documentation of a limit, the point beyond which Western democracies will not go, even when the cost of stopping is measured in a nation's existence. Physics doesn't negotiate. Industrial capacity doesn't respond to rhetoric. And reality, eventually, asserts itself over every commitment that wasn't backed by the willingness to see it through. The divergence between NATO's stated objectives and NATO's actual capabilities has been visible for months. What happens next is not prediction. It's a red line that was always there, finally becoming impossible to ignore.